Rain hammered the open prairie as if the sky itself were chasing her, each drop sharp enough to sting through the thin silk of her torn wedding dress. The chestnut mare beneath her trembled with exhaustion, foam gathering at its mouth, yet the animal pushed on because she begged it to, whispering desperate pleas into its wet mane. Behind her came the shouts, 3 men, their voices muddled by thunder, demanding she stop, demanding she remember who she belonged to. The word burned in her ears. She kicked the mare harder, knowing she had only moments before they closed the distance. A jagged flash of lightning lit the ravine ahead too late. The mare's hooves skidded across slick stone, the reins whipped her wrist and the world tilted violently. She crashed onto the mud-smeared ground, breath torn from her lungs as the mare stumbled, regained footing, then circled her with frantic snorts. Pain rippled up her arm, but fear shoved it aside. She crawled to her knees, listening for hoofbeats behind her, praying the storm drowned every sound. The mare nudged her repeatedly, urging her up, and she staggered onto trembling legs, gripping its mane for balance. The ravine offered a narrow path that disappeared into shadow. With no other choice, she let the mare guide her, leaning heavily as if carried by instinct alone. The storm softened as the canyon walls rose higher, muting the thunder until it sounded like a distant war. Her breath steamed in the chilled air, each inhale heavier than the last. She whispered thanks to the mare, though every word felt like dragging a stone across her tongue. Her vision blurred, and she wondered how far she'd run, how far those men would chase, and whether she'd live long enough to regret fleeing at all. Dawn arrived as a pale glow threading through the rocks. The horse slowed, ears twitching as if sensing something she couldn't. She forced her eyes open and realized she stood at the mouth of a valley hidden so deeply it seemed carved for secrecy. Mist drifted from warm springs that wound through tall grass, and wildflowers in shades she couldn't name shimmered like tiny lanterns. A creek curled lazily between willow trees, and beside it rested a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. The air smelled of wet earth, pine sap, and something faintly sweet, almost unreal after the storm's violence. Her knees gave out the moment the mare stopped at the porch. She clung to one of the posts, fingers numb, breath shallow. The door creaked open before she could call for help. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, early 40s, face lined more from weather than age, wearing a simple shirt rolled to the elbows. His hair was dark and unkempt, his eyes steady and quietly observant, the kind that didn't startle easily. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as though weighing the truth of whatever story had dragged her to his porch. He didn't ask her name before he took her weight and lifted her inside, careful and almost impossibly gentle. Warmth hit her immediately, the scent of wood smoke, stew simmering on a back stove, and clean blankets stacked neatly on a cedar trunk. He set her near the fire and knelt beside her without a word, assessing the bruise blooming along her cheek and the split in her lip. His hands were rough but precise, like he'd tended wounds before, maybe his own. She watched him through blurred vision, searching for any hint of danger, but found only a calm she hadn't felt in months. When he handed her water, her fingers shook so badly she spilled half of it on her dress. He steadied her wrist but didn't comment. She looked around the cabin. Simple, functional, lived in but tidy. A rifle rested near the door. Tools hung in proper order. One chair was patched several times, suggesting repairs were easier than replacements. Whoever he was, he lived alone and he lived hard. He finally spoke, his voice low, even the kind of tone meant not to startle. He asked if she could breathe, if she was hurt anywhere she couldn't see. She nodded weakly, answering only what she had to. She'd fallen, she'd run from something terrible, and she didn't know how far behind the men were. She left out the wedding, the vows she never wanted, the man who treated promises like shackles. She wasn't ready to speak those things aloud. Not yet. He didn't pry. He just said she was safe for now, and though she didn't fully believe him, she wanted to. Exhaustion pulled at her like a tide, but before sleep could claim her, she noticed something through the cabin window, a carving on a tree just beyond the porch. A crescent shape crossed by 3 slashes. She didn't understand it, but instinct told her it wasn't decorative. The man followed her gaze, his expression tightening for only a second, so brief she wondered if she imagined it. He told her to rest, his tone unchanged, but the slight shift in his shoulders betrayed a quiet vigilance she hadn't noticed before. For the first time since fleeing, she felt the strange pull of safety mixed with the urgency of danger still hunting her. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth take over, aware that whatever awaited her next, she had stepped into a place that would not let her leave unchanged. Morning settled over the hidden valley with a deceptive calm, soft sunlight pooling across the grass as if the night's terror were nothing more than a fevered dream. She woke slowly, her body heavy but her mind sharper than before. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the stranger was nowhere inside the cabin. For a moment panic tightened her throat, but then she heard the distant pop of gunfire, 3 short cracks carried on the crisp air. Instinct dragged her upright despite the ache in her ribs. She rushed to the door, half expecting to see the men who had hunted her riding down the hillside. Instead, she found the stranger standing in the meadow, rifle raised toward the treeline. He didn't fire again. He simply watched the ridge with unsettling stillness, like a man used to measuring danger by its silence rather than its noise. She stepped onto the porch, and he turned his head just enough to acknowledge her without lowering the weapon. His eyes, calm the night before, now carried something sharper, alertness carved into his expression. When she asked what he saw, he told her the truth in plain words. Someone else had been in the valley before dawn. Boot tracks, he explained, pointing to a patch of softened earth near the creek. 3 pairs. Gentle impressions, not hurried, as though the men had taken their time studying the valley. The thought of them moving so close made her skin prickle. She clutched the porch railing as if it could hold together the panic swelling inside her. He walked toward her, rifle easy in his grip, and assured her they hadn't come to the cabin. Not yet. It wasn't the comfort he meant it to be, but it was the truth she needed. Inside, he poured coffee and she watched his movements carefully, a man who wasted nothing, who handled everything with deliberate precision. She realized he lived with a constant readiness, the kind that only comes from surviving things that leave permanent shadows. When he finally sat across from her, he didn't ask what she had done to provoke such pursuit. Instead, he asked what she feared most if those men caught her. The question made her breath hitch. She told him enough to paint the truth without drowning in it. She had been promised to a man who believed ownership was the same as love, and the wedding was a sentence she refused to serve. Her refusal humiliated him, and he sent men after her not because he cared she fled, but because he couldn't tolerate the idea she escaped his control. The stranger listened without interruption, his expression unreadable yet grounded in something solid. She braced for judgment, but none came. Instead, he spoke about the valley, the way it protected those who stumbled into it, the way the world outside struggled to find its heart. He said he'd ended up here once for reasons that still didn't feel far enough behind him. His honesty, even stripped of detail, loosened something in her ribcage. He wasn't offering sympathy. He was offering understanding, and it carried far more weight. Thunder rumbled overhead, though the sky held nothing but fast-moving clouds. The sound came again, lower this time, and she realized it wasn't storm but wind pushing violently across the ridgeline. The stranger rose and moved through the cabin, checking shutters and latches. She followed his lead, bracing a window as the first gust slammed into the valley like a freight train. Dust spun through the air, and the willow trees bent almost to breaking. He guided her inside fully, shutting the final latch before the wind turned into a shrieking force that rattled every wooden beam. The cabin shook under the storm's assault, and the lantern's flame flickered wildly. She pressed her back against the wall, palms sweating as the wind howled like a living thing. The stranger stood close enough for her to feel the steady presence radiating off him. When a loose branch struck the roof with a violent crack, she flinched. He didn't. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her with quiet assurance. In the dim light, she could see the storms he carried inside himself, storms he had learned to tame without extinguishing. When the wind finally eased, the world felt eerily hollow. They stepped outside to assess the damage. Branches littered the ground, and the creek churned with debris. Something glinted near a cluster of rocks, twisted rope anchored into the earth. She knelt beside it and traced the frayed ends with trembling fingers. It wasn't leftover from ranch work or a broken fence. It was a trap, designed to snag a rider or horse by the ankle. The stranger crouched beside her, jaw tightening, but he didn't curse or shout. He simply stated the obvious. Someone had been close enough during the storm to set it. Fear surged through her, but beneath it simmered a strange anger. She had run for miles, through rain and darkness, but these men kept closing the distance, as if her refusal to belong to someone was an offense demanding punishment. The stranger must have sensed the shift in her mood. His gaze softened, though he didn't reach for her. Instead, he offered something far more meaningful than empty comfort. His certainty that she wasn't helpless, not here, not anymore. As they walked back toward the cabin, the evening light stretched across the valley, casting long shadows over the grass. She found herself watching him more closely, the way he scanned the treeline without appearing tense, the way he moved with unspoken purpose. He wasn't just hiding here. He was surviving here, holding the valley with a quiet claim forged through resilience rather than violence. By the time they reached the porch, a fragile calm had settled again. But both of them knew the valley wasn't untouched anymore. Someone had marked its edges, testing its defenses. She stood beside him, the air cooling around them, and realized the truth she'd been avoiding. The danger chasing her had already seeped into this hidden refuge. Yet for the first time since fleeing, she didn't feel alone in facing it. The stranger didn't promise safety. He didn't need to. The steady glance he offered her was enough to say that when the men returned, and they would, she wouldn't face them unprotected. Night thickened over the valley, settling like a heavy blanket that smothered every familiar shape. She stood at the window, the glass cool beneath her fingertips, watching the tree line dissolve into darkness. The stranger moved quietly behind her, oiling the rifle with deliberate strokes, each motion a reminder that silence was no longer safety but the calm before an inevitable collision. She didn't ask whether he believed the men would return. He had the expression of someone who had learned long ago that danger never left on its own. It waited, regrouped, and came back hungrier. She stepped away from the window and tried to steady her breathing. The cabin felt smaller than before, as if the walls themselves knew a threat was closing in. The stranger set the rifle aside and studied her, not with pity, but with a level gaze that urged honesty. For a moment she considered pretending she was fine, but something about him, his quiet patience, the way he didn't look away even when she did, made lying pointless. She admitted that every sound outside fed her imagination with cruel possibilities. He nodded once, not dismissing her fear but acknowledging it as real and earned. He told her to rest while he checked the perimeter again, and before she could protest, he took a lantern and stepped into the night. She watched him walk across the clearing, his silhouette caught between flickering gold light and moonlit shadows. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years reading darkness the way others read letters. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the ache in her shoulders, the weight of exhaustion hanging from every limb. Sleep seemed impossible, but when she finally lay down, her mind surrendered to fatigue. A sharp knock jolted her awake. She wasn't sure how long she'd been asleep, only that the stranger's voice reached her through the haze, calm but edged with urgency, telling her to stay low. She slid off the bed just as a rock shattered the window beside her, scattering glass across the floor. She covered her head and crawled toward the corner, heart thundering. The stranger pulled her behind a heavy cupboard and signaled for silence. Outside, footsteps crunched over gravel, followed by a chilling voice calling her name with a mocking sweetness that froze her blood. The fiancé's men had found the valley. The stranger's jaw tightened, and he lifted his rifle, moving with slow precision toward the shadows within the cabin. She felt her pulse race as the intruders circled the porch, boots creaking on wooden planks. One man demanded the stranger open the door and hand her over. Another threatened to burn the cabin if he didn't comply. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying not to breathe too loudly. She could hear the fiancé's voice now, smooth and venomous, promising forgiveness if she surrendered willingly. The sound dragged her back to every moment he had cornered her with false affection twisted into ownership. The stranger stepped into view, positioning himself between her and the door. His stillness was almost unnerving. He didn't shout or bluff. He simply stated that she wasn't going anywhere with them. His calmness infuriated the men outside. A rifle butt slammed against the door and another stone smashed a second window. She closed her eyes as splinters flew across the room, but when she opened them again, the stranger hadn't moved from his post. Gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the confined space. The stranger fired back with startling accuracy, hitting one man's leg and sending another scrambling for cover. He called her name, urging her toward the trapdoor beneath the table he'd shown her earlier. She hesitated only long enough to see him reloading with fierce efficiency before she dove toward the hatch and lowered herself into the root cellar. The small space smelled of earth and preserved apples, and she curled into the darkness, straining to hear the chaos above. The gunfire continued, muffled now by the thick boards between them. She pressed both hands against her ears, wishing she could unhear each shot. Eventually the sounds shifted, footsteps running, curses tearing through the night, and then an eerie lull. Minutes dragged on, each one longer than the last. When the trapdoor finally creaked open, she flinched, but the stranger's face appeared, dimly lit by lantern glow. Blood streaked his forearm, and a cut above his brow dripped slowly, but his eyes were steady. He helped her out of the cellar, guiding her carefully across the ruined cabin floor. Bullet holes pocked the walls and shards glittered around their boots like frost. He told her the men had fled but not far. They had retreated up the ridge, likely regrouping. His words didn't try to comfort her. They prepared her. She found herself studying the line of his jaw, the tension there, and the resolve etched into his movements. She realized he had faced violence before, enough that tonight didn't rattle him, only sharpened him. As she stitched the wound on his arm, her hands trembled, though she forced herself to breathe steadily. He didn't flinch, not even when the needle pressed through torn skin. She asked how he remained so calm, and he answered simply that fear wasn't something a person erased, it was something they learned to walk with. His tone carried no bravado, just truth forged from experience. She found herself wanting to know more about the life that had carved such steadiness into him, but before she could ask, a distant shout echoed across the valley. They both turned toward the window, though there was little to see in the darkness. The stranger said the men weren't finished. They would return with more men or more fire, or both. She felt a sharp sting of guilt, convinced she had dragged danger into the one place that had seemed untouched by cruelty. But he shook his head as if reading her thoughts. This valley had never been invisible, he said. It had only been waiting for the day its peace was challenged again. The words landed heavier than she expected. She stood beside him in the dim cabin, surrounded by broken glass and gunpowder's metallic scent, and understood that running had reached its limit. The men would come back prepared. So would the stranger. The valley was no longer just a hiding place. It had become a battleground, and she was now part of its defense whether she felt ready or not. A low wind swept across the grass outside, carrying the faint echoes of the intruders retreating to regroup. She met the stranger's gaze, recognizing not reassurance but partnership. The night had shifted both of them. He had chosen to stand with her. And she realized she could no longer afford to remain a trembling passenger in her own story. The valley waited in breathless stillness, knowing dawn would bring more than light. It would bring the reckoning neither she nor the stranger could avoid. Caleb woke before dawn, the desert still holding its breath in the gray silence. The fire in the hearth had long died, leaving only the faint smell of smoke drifting through the cabin. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, boots planted firmly on the floorboards, waiting for the weight in his chest to loosen. It didn't. It hadn't for weeks. Some men carried their past like a badge, his clung like a chain. And now, with Mara sleeping in the next room and every choice pressing against his ribs, the chain felt heavier than ever. He rose and pushed open the back door. Cold air bit his face. In the distance, the ridge was a jagged silhouette, sharp enough to cut the sky in half. The ranch lay quiet, too quiet for a man used to running from trouble. He didn't belong in quiet places. They forced him to hear his own thoughts. He heard footsteps behind him. Mara's. He didn't have to turn to know. She walked in a careful way as if she feared leaving a trace anywhere she stepped. The sun had barely crept over the hills, yet she already had a shawl around her shoulders, cheeks pink from the chill. "You're up early," she said, though her voice carried something else, something like suspicion threaded with soft concern. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. "Some nights don't let you." She moved to stand beside him. For a long moment, they watched the horizon without speaking. There were things she wanted to ask. He could feel them pressing against the silence, but she seemed to restrain herself. Instead, she folded her arms tightly as if the morning cold had seeped straight through her bones. "You said we'd talk today," she finally whispered. "And we will." He kept his eyes on the land. "But you should hear the truth, not the pieces I used to tell people to make myself look cleaner." "I don't need you clean," she said. "I just need you honest." The words hit him harder than she knew. Honest men didn't have to rehearse confessions. He had spent years practicing the art of omission. But hiding anything now would only rot what little trust had begun to grow between them. "You know I wasn't always alone," he began. "Before I came to this valley I rode with 3 men. Men who believed fear kept a town quiet and silence kept guilt buried." Mara turned her face toward him. "Not fearful, studying, measuring. I left because they crossed a line I wouldn't follow," he continued. "But leaving isn't the same as undoing. One of them, Crane, never forgave me for walking away." "Is he the one you've been watching the ridge for?" she asked. "He'll come. Men like him never let things stay buried. And if he figures out you're here, he'll use you to drag me back into the life I cut loose." Mara stiffened, clutching her shawl tighter. "Then tell me why you didn't send me away. If danger is coming, why let me stay in this house?" Her voice wasn't frightened. It was demanding. And he respected her more for that than for any gratitude she'd shown him since the night he saved her from the burning barn. "Because you didn't break when life tried to crush you," he said bluntly. "I've seen strong men fall apart with less. But you, tied, abandoned, half-burned, you still fought to stand. I figured you deserved someone to stand with you, even if that someone was a man with too many ghosts. She let out a breath that trembled, but her gaze held steady. And what if your ghosts reach this door? Then they'll find me waiting, he said, no hesitation. Not you. She studied him, and for the first time he saw something shift in her expression. Something between acceptance and fear of caring too much. She stepped back into the cabin, leaving the door open behind her. He watched her move with a heaviness he didn't like. She shouldn't have to live under the shadow of another man's revenge. By midday the sky had turned a hard, unbroken blue. Mara worked quietly, preparing a simple meal, each motion controlled, almost deliberate. Caleb noticed she avoided looking at him for long. He understood why. Once truth enters a room, it rearranges everything. After they ate, she brought out a small wooden box she kept hidden beneath the bed. He raised an eyebrow, not at the box itself but at how tightly she held it. What's that? My past, she answered. If you're brave enough to tell yours, I should be able to face mine. She opened it. Inside lay a single charred ribbon, its edges curled inward like wilted petals. Alongside it, a brass button half melted. Caleb recognized them instantly, remnants from the barn, from the dress she wore the night someone left her to die. I kept these, she said, because I didn't want to forget what almost happened to me. But now they feel like dead weight. He didn't touch the items. He didn't offer comfort she didn't ask for. Instead he nodded once, slow and firm. You're right. You don't owe the past anything. She hesitated, then spoke with a kind of raw bravery he hadn't expected. You said Crane might come. If he does, I won't be the girl who was tied to a post. I'm not helpless, Caleb. I never said you were, he replied. But you still treat me like I might break. He held her stare. Because the world tried to break you once. Forgive me for not wanting to watch it try again. She stepped closer. I don't want protection that costs you your life. If he comes, we face him together. Her resolve sent a jolt through him, equal parts admiration and fear. He didn't want her anywhere near the kind of violence Crane lived for. But denying her strength would only insult what she had clawed back from the flames. Before he could answer, a distant thud echoed across the valley. Mara froze. Caleb moved to the window, jaw tightening as a rider appeared on the ridge, dark coat, stiff posture, a silhouette carved from every bad memory he tried to forget. Crane. Mara stepped beside him, not behind. You said you'd face him, she murmured. I'm holding you to that. Caleb reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Stay close. And if he speaks, don't believe a word. They walked outside together. The wind had picked up, carrying dust and swirling ribbons across the yard. Crane dismounted slowly, eyes locked on Caleb with a smile too flat to be human. Been a long time, Crane drawled. Didn't expect to find you playing house. Caleb didn't rise to the bait. Say what you came to say. Crane's gaze slid to Mara, lingering with ugly curiosity. Caleb stepped to block the view, but Mara didn't hide. I came to finish what you ran from, Crane said. And to remind you that no one quits our past. Caleb lifted the rifle. You're wrong. The standoff stretched tight and thin. Then, without warning, Crane reached for his gun, but Mara moved first. She swung the heavy iron poker she'd carried behind her leg, striking Crane's wrist with a crack that sent his weapon flying. Caleb fired a warning shot past his shoulder, forcing him backward until he stumbled and fell hard. Crane looked up, shocked, more by Mara than the bullet. Caleb stepped forward. This ends now. Crane saw the resolve in both their faces and understood what he'd never believed possible. The man he once controlled wasn't afraid anymore, and the woman he'd dismissed as weak was the one who'd disarmed him. Without another word, Caleb drove him off the property, ensuring he'd think twice before returning. When the dust finally settled, Mara's hands trembled, not from fear but from release. You didn't need saving, Caleb said quietly. No, she answered. I just needed someone who didn't expect me to stay broken. They stood together in the wind-scraped yard, not healed, not perfect, but finally unburdened. Their pasts were still scarred, but the future, whatever shape it took, was theirs to choose, not survive. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt something loosen inside him. The chain didn't feel so heavy anymore.